Pat, just describe the creation of the Alms House that kind of includes that information about every county had to have one, the county seat, government buildings.
During the early days of Maryland, every county was decreed that they had to have certain public buildings, including an almshouse, as well as a jail and a courthouse and other buildings. Carroll County was created in 1837, and it wasn't until 1852 that we actually got the almshouse. It had to be approved by the legislation so that the funds could be appropriated for building it. It's quite an undertaking to build such a large structure. And until that time, people were held in homes under a pension system, or some orphans were sent off to Frederick. Frederick's almshouse was active during the Revolutionary War, so it was a really early almshouse. When it was built, it took about a year. The commissioners were very active in its design and its construction. There was a brickyard close to here. There was a quarry down in the woods for the foundation stones. It was built architecturally as a balloon structure, which meant some mortise joints, but mostly nailed joints infilled with bricks. So they built the bricks. The commissioners inspected the bricks before they went in the walls. The walls are 17 inches thick from these bricks. They built a boiler so the place would be heated. They ensured that there would be ventilation with transom windows over the doors and ventilator shafts in the walls. The commissioners had traveled to almshouses throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania to find the best and latest technology to put in this almshouse. The almshouse was built on a large farm, about 300 acres, and later sections were sold off by the county and became 175 acres. Currently, we believe we have around 100 acres because over time, the land was sent off to become the hospital, the ag center, the baseball field, and so forth. So the county owned the land and all the buildings from the beginning and still does. The purpose of an almshouse was to care for people who could not care for themselves. And they came from all walks of life, and they were all different ages. And we were open in 1852 with mostly elderly people. Then after the Civil War, we had a lot of broken families here. After the men couldn't support, the family, they would put them here for a few weeks, a month, a year. Then we had a lot of moms who had no longer support because women basically could not have an income back then. They had to go somewhere. So we had a lot of children in the almshouse. It was a heavily young population. I could say half the population was about 30 years old or younger. And that was until about 1900 when there was new social programs. Because the almshouse system developed in the United States, they also started looking about how children and mothers were being cared for, and they felt having them at home rather than an institution was much better. So after 1900, there were very few children here. And you might wonder, how were children educated in the almshouse? The public school system started in Maryland after the Civil War in the late 1800s. Up to then, children were indentured to a community member, and we have a belief that a lot of times these were relatives. A child, first grade age, 5 or 6, would be indentured until they're 18 for a boy or 16 for a girl, and they would learn a trade. They'd receive clothing, and they'd receive money when they turned that age. Up to then, they were working for someone, and they also went to school to learn reading, math, and writing. So basically, the system of almshouses was to have people be supported somehow, learn a little means of support for themselves. If they could work at the farm, they did. They made a lot of butter. There was a very active farm with over 10,000 pounds of pork products in a year, bushels and bushels, 150 bushels of apples, potatoes, 150 bushels of potatoes, turnips, lots of wheat, corn, oats. The almshouse supplied the jail with all of its bacon, butter, and flour for bread. They also sold the remainders, and they also tried to balance their own budget. One issue was how many tramps and hobos came to knock on the door asking for a job or a place to stay overnight. And in one year, there was well over 3,000 extra meals served. It's really hard to balance a budget when you have, 100 extra people, day to day. So that was, again, after the Civil War when things were in transition in the country. The almshouse did go until 1965. Gradually, other systems of aid came into play and fewer and fewer residents lived here. It was finally closed, and then because it's an intact Pennsylvania German farm with beautiful buildings, the county wisely decided to turn it into a farm museum or museum of rural agriculture in Carroll County before that was lost. The staff to operate the almshouse. Now this is an interesting question because the steward and his wife were the main people in charge. That was a political appointment to get the steward here. So the stewards changed from time to time, but sometimes the same steward came back. It depended on the political structure of the time. Now the steward was paid $400 a year from 1852 well until after World War II, so you had to make do with that salary. And then the matron was paid about $75. She was in charge of all the people cooking and feeding and making all of the linens that were used here. She really had a busy job. There was a washerwoman or laundress to do the wash. There was a fireman, and everyone thinks, oh, could they be putting out fires all the time? Well, actually, the firemen kept the fires going, so everybody would be warm and cozy. They had that big boiler in the farm, in the big house, and then each of these little dormitory rooms for men had their own little stove, little wood stove. And then there was a teamster, and the teamster, like we know today, there was truck drivers. Teamsters back then drove teams of horses to pull all of the farm equipment. The almshouse started with the main structure for the women and children and also for serving food and meeting the public. And then the dormitory was added for the men to live in, and that with their separate sitting room, with a summer kitchen, and that was a place to take baths. Unusual thing about this almshouse is everyone took a bath twice a week, highly unusual for the time. In a few years, they built a very large almshouse barn to house the animals and keep the hay, and also a pig yard in front, piggery, and that's where they raised like 300 pigs each year. It was very big. They also had a place for storing corn, a corn crib with a wagon shed. Nearby was an ice house. The ice house now we know is the blacksmith shop. Back in 1941, a blacksmith moved into the almshouse as a resident and wanted to do some smithing, so they put a floor in the ice house. By 1941, we had refrigerators. So later, when they wanted to have more demonstrations of blacksmithing, the ice house was filled in to support anvils. I think we have 6 anvils in there now, so it couldn't keep the weight. So unfortunate. I would like to have seen that ice house. The other buildings that are still here are the spring house, which is running water, cold water, about 50 degrees, in a trench, and you put in your milk cans to cool off the milk. It's also to keep leftovers in crocks, stone crocks. We have a firehouse, and again, this one though is for, we have a firehouse, and that is for putting the fires out. We have a wheeled cart and a few leather buckets. I'm glad we never caught fire because it looks fairly inadequate. The wheel cart has a hose, and that would be attached to a pumper truck. The pumper, of course, would be loaded with water, and then men would be on either side pumping the water out. Good thing we didn't need it. So there's a hay barracks that was moved after Jeb Stuart came through town. That was put here back in the old days. We also have a cemetery everyone knows all over across the street from the hospital. That was actually included in the 30s. There was a number of residents here who were buried here. A number of them also were buried in church cemeteries. But after it got a little too crowded, they decided to design that Potter's Field for people about 1936, and Matthias made the stones. So it's called Potter's Field. It's kind of a memorial, I think, to all of the people who lived and died here. The almshouse has always been a county facility, and it was a large farm. There's an English tradition of having the poor work for themselves, to support themselves. So the almshouse system is similar to that. So we did have a really large farm. They, again, sold all the products that they produced and also fed themselves. The farm was also a showplace for farm equipment because as you know, in the late Victorian era, there was a lot of new equipment based on steam power or on mechanization from cast iron parts. So like when the McCormick Reaper came to town, they said, oh, let's bring it out to the Alms house. And they had already had a lime kiln, one of the other duties here, burning lime for fertilizer. So they brought it here and demonstrated how it would work, because these big, beautiful fields, and everybody knew it. The residents who could worked on the farm, and they also worked in the quarry, and they also made butter. There was a lot of jobs. There was a number of residents who could not work, so they would just be cared for. The county paid for all of the seeds and equipment and calves and anything that they needed. It was always petitioned by the steward and then paid later. And he was required to list every year an annual report in the paper so they could see what was produced, what it was sold for, who they paid for every job, shingling, plumbing work, anything was all mentioned and all accounted for. And that's how they tried to show a balanced budget. One of the stewards, John Tracy, he would report every quarter in the paper all about everything that they had and all the fabulous things that were happening at the Alms house. And later he became a delegate to the state legislature. So it was kind of a stepping stone for him, I think, to get his name in the paper. From the very first day, anyone wanting to live in the Alms house had to petition the county commissioners. There was an ad put in the paper saying, those who wish to come now. That was in May 1853. After that, a family member could go to the commissioner and say, please take my elderly father. I'll pay you $100 a year. It was always a kind of a negotiable amount. Someone would bring their daughter or wife or someone who was blind or injured. The homeless on the streets, citizens would come and by and say, so-and-so is on the street, please take him in. Then it wasn't by law that they had to stay. So we had some residents who would leave. And like we have a little document on the wall, this one man, Frank Kelball, he left. He said, food's no good. And then December 28th, he's asking, oh, well, I'd really like to come back. So they would let him, come back. Then we had another interesting story of one of the residents who was supposedly frozen to death, and he was brought to the Alms house, and then it said in the paper, well, when he read about his death, he was quite surprised. So it was people who were out there, needing help. The quarry is interesting. We actually have two quarries back in the woods, and now one is used as an amphitheater. The other one has a little well across the little path from it, and that was to water the horses. You can find actually the holes in the stones where it was dynamited. The quarry was quite active into the World War II era. Not all residents were too happy about working in a quarry, while they were resident here. But it was mined for steps, and the Sandy Mount Church, I'm not sure which one, has the step from the Alms House quarry, and the foundation stones here. And they did build the jail, additions to the courthouse, the various public structures. It's that green, that malachite green stone that's indigenous. When the Alms House closed, George Greer was the county administrator at the time, and he was a friend of Landon Burns, who had a huge collection of agricultural equipment in storage at University of Maryland. So they together formed a committee to study the idea of a farm museum, and they all agreed it would be a great idea. And because every building is still in its original location, direction of the buildings is right, and the use and function. So it was great because there's not too many intact farms. Then meanwhile, we've brought in some buildings. We needed a building to show plows, so that was built, and also for the big threshers. So those are new buildings. Currently, we have a log barn that's being built here, the Hoff Barn, and that is going to be really great because the barn was built in about 1780, and we can show the very earliest Pennsylvania German farming from the very first settlers, and then compare that to Pennsylvania German farming in the 1800s when things were much easier and speedier and faster and different crops were being grown. So that's really cool. There's a couple other barns that have been added to house exhibits or for recreational purposes and for wedding receptions and that kind of thing. And we have some animal cages, some playground equipment, that kind of thing, to kind of flesh it out so that every family member can have an opportunity to enjoy the place. More interesting question maybe would be, why don't you portray an almshouse today? So, that would be, and we don't because it would look like this. And what we do with our Alms house, all the dormitories now are traditional arts rooms where we can show you the trades and techniques of spinning, weaving, quilting, cooking, so things that actually people do. So it's more of a living history museum. And we use the buildings maybe more to a capacity that you engage people rather than just a static display. One aspect of researching the Alms house was to see the products that were grown here. And I'm very interested in what kind of turnip, what kind of potato, because then we can show those very same crops growing in the heirloom garden that is down there by the animals. I'd really like to grow Carroll County crops and the kind of barley and corn that they would have had here, because then that really reinforces the whole lifestyle that was used back then. And then you could cook those things. We have a root cellar, just like from the research we discovered was underneath this curing shed. So we've re-established the root cellar, and now we can put the vegetables in and almost recreate maybe what life was like back in the 1800s, early 1900s for people here. A typical men's room in the dorm would have housed 2 people, and they had a simple bed, a desk, all the little belongings, a washstand, and pegs for hanging the clothes on the wall. The pictures and other things they would bring with them. Some people had nice furniture, especially women, and some of the women's rooms in the large house had fancy furniture. Basically, it was a place of rest, and just like people today, when they go to a nursing home or a living center, they have very few belongings with them. Pennsylvania, the reason it's Pennsylvania German rather than something else, Pennsylvania German houses have a door in the middle. Pennsylvania German houses have a door in the middle and windows on either side, either 2 windows or 4 windows. The Alms house has 2 doors because one is public and one is private, and then extra windows to make like 9 openings. And that's the main farmhouse. Behind it is the dormitory for men. Now in a Pennsylvania German farmhouse, there's usually an L with the fireplace in it, because it was fire prevention to have your fireplace away for your cooking, away from the house. So now we have a dormitory with a great big fireplace in it for the summer kitchen, and that is the L. So it's basically the Pennsylvania German structure, but just very expanded and to house, up to 50 people. So that's, to me, very interesting to discover when you're looking at the structure and why did they build it the way they did. You might say, why is there all over here? Much later, the tunnel was added after they had a lighting system, because we have a picture without it and a picture with it. So that was in the 30s or so. The tunnel was added for handicapped accessibility. Also, when you look at the Traditional Arts Center or Living History Center, you can see that it's not symmetrical any longer, and that's because a wing was added at the end back when they had diphtheria or typhoid coming through and they needed an infirmary. So that's the belief there.